You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
You in 30 years.
Whoa.
Some advice. Open a Laurel Road checking account when you refinance your student loans. You could get a rate as low as 1.37% variable APR, plus a cash bonus.
I can do that.
Also, don't date Parker.
Ew, the defense attorney?
Trust me.
Save yourself with Laurel Road. Visit laurelroad.com/saveyourself for more information. Rates depend on your credit profile and include discounts. Terms and conditions apply. Laurel Road is a brand of KeyBank, member FDIC.
Episode 156, The Paradox.
Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome to The Paradox. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Larson. Thank you for joining me as we explore the U.S. medical system in a fun and informative format through expert analysis. Today's expert is Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. He's a PhD in social psychology, and he specializes in health policy, political psychology, and conspiracy theories. Perfect for this episode, because we're going to be talking about COVID, of course, and we're going to discuss today the problem with messaging. And Dr. Peter Sandman at the SIDRAP site, and that'll be linked to in the show notes page at theparadox.com/156, as well as other links that we mentioned in the show, other shows that related to this episode. But we're going to focus on the erosion of public trust within public institutions, specifically public health. We're going to look at the psychological profiles that cause this problem, what is the psychology that goes into groupthink, and what could be done to promote and restore the trust that's been lost with these institutions, if at all. I think you'll find the discussion very interesting. Dr. Pomerantz is very knowledgeable in psychology, and he specializes, like I said, to conspiracy theories and how they form. I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you go and read at some point the article written by Dr. Sandman. It is excellent. It goes over the problems that have occurred in the COVID pandemic with messaging and then how things can be sort of fixed, although mainly he just goes into the problems and the failures. And what should be done during a pandemic, how you actually build back those relationships is not specifically addressed in his paper, which is why I wanted to have Dr. Pomerantz on for the show. But it's kind of a longer episode, so I want to keep this introduction short. Again, thanks to all my new listeners from We Are Libertarians. So without further ado, can we repair trust in public health with Dr. Aaron Pomerantz? Enjoy. All right, well, hi. I'm here with my friend, Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. He's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. He received his PhD in social psychology from the University of Oklahoma in 2021 and researches social judgments and decision-making in the areas of psychology and law, health psychology, and political psychology. And we're going to be talking about the paper written by Dr. Peter Sandman at the SIDRAP as guest writer. He's an expert in risk communications. It's titled Commentary, 8 Things U.S. Pandemic Communicators Still Get Wrong. You can find a link to that at the show notes, which I'd highly recommend you read the whole thing since we're only going to discuss a portion of that today. You can find that at theparadox.com/156. Aaron, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's very weird to be called doctor by an actual medical doctor. Like I'm very used to being called Dr. Pomerantz by a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds. But I definitely like when I go to the doctor, I'm like, yes, I'm Aaron Pomerantz, PhD, not don't call me doctor.
We have all kinds of people who throw the doctor thing around in the hospital who most people would not consider doctors too. So it just kind of depends who you are. And I always tell people, it's hard because I've been in practice now for quite a while, and I've experienced this now where, I'm just Eric, right, for most of my partners, or I should say new people on the partner track. It's like 2 years in our group. And they'll call me Dr. Larson. I'm like, really, it's very unsettling for you to call me Dr. Larson. You're another anesthesiologist. Med students, nurses, I'm okay with that, and even lots of nurses just call me by my first name. So anyway, it's something that takes a while to get used to.
I'm still getting used to it because both of my parents are Dr. Pomerantz. My dad's a medical doctor and my mom's a PhD. And so people say Dr. Pomerantz, and I still have that my parents aren't here, dude. Like this is Texas. They're in New Jersey. Oh, right. Me. Yeah. What do you want?
It's like the first time you get Mr. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, I'm not old. But yeah. And then I,
Then you have
talk
a kid
to them, and I'm
before
like,
you know it.
yeah. yeah.
Well,
There you go.
Let's talk about this piece because when I read this a couple weeks ago, I tried to get Dr. Sandman on, and he's was unavailable, and he's older, and he's not really doing interviews at this point. He's later in his career, just kind of writes things for on risk communication. But I think it went over a lot of really good things. So we're going to talk about COVID and sort of specifically what people who have been communicating risk, who've been setting policy, and what they've been doing wrong. And he had plenty of examples for what you need to do during a public health crisis and what has been done or what's been going on right now. So I always want to start by talking about the mistakes. He highlighted 5 mistakes. One is that the public health officials were over-reassuring to the public. Second, they panicked and overreacted often. They flubbed the rationale for the lockdowns. They abandoned the flatten the curve strategy, or at least the messaging, and they insisted that public health would be in charge. So I think we can all think, if we're being honest with ourselves, we can imagine all those problems with all 5 of those points that we've seen in the last almost 2 years now in the messaging. Which of those do you think has been the biggest problem? Because one thing that has clearly happened is there's been erosion of trust with the public towards public health officials, specifically the FDA and CDC, and of course, local health departments and things like that by extension. Which of those do you think has been sort of the biggest problem when it comes to the erosion of trust?
I think I'm going to give an unsatisfying answer, but one that I often give as a social psychologist, and that's like, I don't think you can pick. It depends would be my answer.
Sure.
That's the it's any statistical discipline always says it depends, and it sucks to give that answer. But I think really, if you asked, if you grabbed 5 people off the street and you said what was one, I don't think you'd have many of them. B, I don't think you'd have a lot of them be totally approving of the government's handling of COVID. And I think you'd have 5 different answers. Certainly, I could say what I found more obnoxious, and I would say definitely that last one of public health being in charge. But I think they're all symptomatic of just a real underlying arrogance, and not just an arrogance, but a clueless arrogance behind how they've chosen to communicate about COVID. And each of these has really seriously undermined trust from the public, like you pointed out. And it was actually interesting, as I read the article, I was putting on my health psychologist brain, and I didn't think my 3 areas of research focus on health psychology, psychology and law, and within political psychology, I really like looking into both psychology and religion and conspiracy theories, and those kind of feed into each other. And I was like, this will be a health psychology thing. And I realized health psychology really didn't come up for me. And as I was reading this, the first thing that came up to me was really this idea that comes from the psychology of the justice system, and that is legitimacy. How do you view a government as having a rightful authority? I mean, it's really just psychological. It's making a psychological construct out of the idea of consent of the governed, and we like to pretend that everything we do as humans is rational and calm, cool, and collected and orderly. But in reality, it's not. And letting people have control over us, I think, is more tenuous than people certainly the people in authority would like to admit. So when you have, let's start with the over-reassuring. There's a trust that's necessary for there to be legitimacy of any government entity or any entity in general, right? You wouldn't trust if you're extending your kid to a school, and they tell you, they're promising you the sky about your kid's intellectual and academic outcomes. You're probably going to set off alarm bells, right? To say nothing of if they make promises that they can't keep. And I thought the over-reassuring was definitely a huge harm to legitimacy because it undermined that trust, and they're making promises that not only that they can't keep, but they didn't have the power to enact. It's going back to even the Trump administration. He enacted a bunch of executive actions that he really weren't in his authority, and the entire idea is, well, this will fix it, and then it didn't, and then public trust continues to erode. I would say as far as panicking and overreacting, that's the same thing. When you cry wolf too many times, people are going to swing the other way. And when you say there is no wolf and there ends up being a wolf, people are going to swing the other way. You can't be alarmist and you can't underplay something. And it's been really odd how the government has done both. I say the government. Generally, when I say the government, I'm probably referring to Fauci.
Sure. In
this discussion, but I mean, the CDC is a government entity, and things are gonna. I'm forcibly reminded of other times this has happened in society. You know, people when they panic and they overreact. I mean, we even see it today. People are talking about once again, shutting down schools, going back to full March 2020 because of the Omicron variant.
Right.
And it's like we don't. Admittedly, I'm maybe I'm a bad person for admitting this, but I'm just so burned out on COVID stuff, and I am vaxxed, I am boosted. I'm like, okay, bring it on. There's nothing we can do anyway.
Yeah.
So it's not like I've been sitting, but again, I think honestly, in some ways, that's the healthy response, is not to just sit there and go, oh my gosh, like this is not in my control. I don't have control over a germ. I have things that are actually under my control, like trying to get enough sleep with a newborn kid, like trying to prep for my classes, like trying to get my grading done. The Omicron variant really isn't under my control, but from what little I've even seen, we don't know enough about this. That seems to be the biggest thing from the actual reputable sources. Surely you can speak to this more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would guess I would summarize what you said is, so you have equal parts paternalism from the government and sort of, and then other, it's just, I would say not incompetence, but impotence, right? The reassurance, the ability to control things that are clearly outside the control or sort of understanding, right? And it seems like those are the two driving factors for the fact that people no longer trust what they hear, because although they may feel in some levels the government can deliver on some of those things, or they have the knowledge, they clearly don't at other times. And I don't know. I mean, is that a typical sort of thing you see psychologically? Like once people start doubting things, I guess it goes to the conspiracy theories, right? Because you have people who have misinformation, you have all these other things that are going on. And I would imagine that helps feed those sorts of viewpoints and positions, right? I mean, is that accurate? That those things is what drives your problems?
I mean, that's been kind of the biggest thing for me. Well, not the biggest. There's so many things that have gone wrong with it.
There's a lot of big things with this thing. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but this is one of them. I forget who wrote this article. I don't even remember much of the article said. I just remember the headline, and it was that Anthony Fauci is the biggest advocate for the anti-vaccine movement we have seen in 100 years. And this was not from some website that gives your computer every single virus you can imagine. This was from a reputable news source. And I really agreed with that art. I really agree with that idea because one thing, even before COVID, vaccines, were an issue for me. There's so much interesting psychology that goes into how people become anti-vax or pro-vax and how that goes. And conspiracy theories, especially, it's a very emerging and exciting area of research. And we know there's a link between distrust of the government and tendency towards conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories, the problem with studying them psychologically is that there's a difference between a conspiracy theory and just a conspiracy. One of the bigger papers in this area even points this out. Like this is one of those granddaddy papers that if you do scientific writing and you don't cite this one, you're in trouble. And he talks about the fact that 20 years ago, if somebody had said the government was spying on all of us through our computers, we'd have thought that person was a tinfoil hat. But here we are, and the article was written 2018, 2019. Now we're in 2021. Same thing, right? Like we know that the government does that. So there is some fine lines there. And as this trust in the government rises, tendency to believe in conspiracies rise too. And here you have just, when you promise, it's only for 2 weeks, which I guess would be that third thing, flatten the curve rhetoric, right?
Right, yeah.
We're only locking down to help. We're only locking down for a short-term time because it's going to have this and this effect. And it doesn't. You are feeding conspiracy theories. And then when you do it all, and then you go on to say, well, the only way to solve this is for me to have all power on heaven, to wax scriptural, all authority on heaven and earth is given to me, and I should have it. And I would say that was being mean to Anthony Fauci, except he literally said the words, I am science. So yeah, that there's a grandiosity to the claims being made here. And that just feeds into the conspiratorial mindset, and it just chips away at any source of, or a sense of trust. or ability for the government and the CDC to stand as a sense or as a source of trust and have a sense of trust from the public at large. And on the one hand, are you going to always have everyone's trust? No, there's always going to be a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, sure.
Not every conspiracy theory, in fact, I would say the majority of them are not particularly worthwhile. And actually, that's what I loved about Dr. Sandman. He kind of picks on certain people who trend more towards the ridiculous in their explanations. But it's not irrational, and it's not exactly tinfoil hat when somebody says, give me power, and you go, does he have an agenda for that? Especially not when that person has their own sketchy record, historically, let alone during this pandemic. So I would say, like, that's kind of the long roundabout way of answering the question. I can't pick anything as the one singular worst that eroded public trust, because they've all done a really, really good job of it, and it's really, really strong.
You know, one of the things that Dr. Sandman talked about in his paper is that this insistence on speaking with one voice when it comes to science or when it comes to policy. And I think, you know, when it is important to have a unified sort of vision and idea of where you're going, where you're headed. I mean, that's the role of a leader, right? To set policy and say we need to figure out our measures to get to whatever our goal is, right? I mean, you have to set the goals, and hopefully you arrive at that through consensus in some way. Of, you know, if you're passing legislation, right, you have to get consensus from the Democrats, Republicans, to sort of generally where your goal is, and then how you get there is, those are the details that could kind of messy sometimes, but you would generally have a goal that's understandable and definable. And the problem I feel like with this one voice message is that you are in some ways expected to only have one way of looking at things, and there's no other allowing of, you know, questioning. There's one person, and I guess this speaks to your ultimate authority, right? That this one voice is truly like one voice. It's really kind of crazy for a country that is, I mean, there are 330 million people, and I think there are probably 330 million opinions of, you know, what we need to do.
There's a lot of there's such strength and weakness to speak. I mean, again, like with anything, there's good and a bad side to everything. And one of the social psychological terms that has entered the common parlance, I would say recently, and then that means it gets abused and misused. That's is groupthink. And, you know, the classic example of groupthink that actually inspired people to research it back in the 60s was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, you know, whatever we think of JFK and his cabinet, he had a smart cabinet, people with experience of war, but there was a desire for consensus in that cabinet. And when groupthink is actually happening, there's a desire for consensus over the truth, or consensus over, you know, effectiveness. And you have what are called mind guards, and people who squash down opposition. You know, the humans have a fundamental need to belong. We nobody no, that's not true. I was going to say nobody likes to be the outsider. Some people create their entire identity about being the outsider, which just means that they're trying to belong with another group. But generally, we want to belong to the group. We want to be a good person. We want to be liked. We want to be accepted. And so what you'll have is people shoving down, ignoring, or even convincing themselves through cognitive dissonance, another social psych term that's in the public parlance. The cognitive dissonance, they resolve that in favor of the group's ideas above what they actually know is a good idea, or what they know to be true, what they actually believe. And we've seen that this is really, really powerful, and it goes down to the level of fundamental, like even perception. Justification of people holding the beliefs that contradict their own values or even the objective truth. It's a really, really powerful effect. One of the classic studies of this was actually they had people do a really, really boring task, like mind-numbing boring task. I think it was like turning dials for like an hour, and then they gave them $1 and they said, "Hey, would you mind convincing somebody else to do this for us?" And the guy who's supposed to ask somebody else to come and he's not in. If you would do this for us. And if they paid them $1, that the subjects who would spend an hour turning knobs, they actually said, no, I really did enjoy that task. I really did enjoy that task, because in their heads they're going, why else would I have done that? I only got paid $1. It was interesting, if you paid people $20, they were like, I'll lie to the person, but I didn't think it was that fun. So we see this is a really powerful effect that people can delude themselves, and when there's groupthink in play, you're deluding yourself and you're silencing other people because you want that consensus. And sometimes consensus is good. I don't think consensus is bad. That's where I find myself very much in the middle on a lot of COVID issues, and this is one of them where I'm like, sometimes it is wise to speak with one voice when there is actually something worth speaking with one voice on. So I don't see the point of us saying that we need to entertain a diversity of perspectives on the heliocentric model of the universe.
Sure.
Or I don't think we need to. I don't think you should be forced to justify yourself beyond somebody who thinks if they just put the right arrangement of crystals, somebody will be just as pain-free during a surgery as if you do your job. The thing is that we then like to pretend that everything goes in that box, right? Like you heard Anthony Fauci saying things like, I am the science, or I represent science. I'm like, it's really arrogant. And that happens a lot in science. That's happened a lot historically in science. It happens in my own discipline of social psych even. And I think the two biggest microcosms I can think of, biggest microcosm being an interesting little term there, would be like the violent media sphere and the implicit bias training sphere. And when it came 10,000-foot view, for the longest times, like literally over 70 years at this point, social psychologists have been convinced of a certain class have been convinced that watching violent media makes you more violent. We can attribute all these rising violence levels to violent media, even though violence is actually falling. And that became gospel. And it became gospel for probably about 50 years until a younger generation who grew up in the 80s and 90s playing video games was like, this is just insane. How can you blame Columbine on doom?
Right.
And it led to I think a mistrust. Especially those of us who are younger, and when we teach, when you're younger and you're teaching kids in grad school and you're not that much older than them, and you bring up, these people say violent video games cause violence. You see the eye rolls because they just know that that's not true. But when you talk to the older people, that's probably a ageist term. When you talk to more established psychologists, the idea that violent video games, couldn't cause violence is just, it's absurd to them. And they're like, well, violent video, like they're horrified by it. So obviously it would make other people more violent. And and that has, despite these iffy findings, this has gone to the government several times trying to basically ban violent media or regulate violent media, kind of like what happened in the 80s with the RIAA hearings and song lyrics. Similarly, with implicit bias, the idea is that implicit bias is this established thing, and all social psychologists agree with it. Well, no, that's absolutely not true. Dan Gilbert at Harvard, one of the most eminent psychologists currently working, has talked at length and for years about how a lot of this implicit bias training stuff isn't going to work. No, just having people imagine themselves as a minority is not going to make them more empathetic. What the hell is wrong with you? But again, government policy, and this time it did win, and those are the implicit bias training things we're seeing lose in the public sphere. And the consequence is now that when people come up and say, hey, I have an actual good idea that could work, or they come up and say, hey, violent media doesn't make people commit mass shootings, but it does make you more aggressive, it can make you more competitive, maybe you shouldn't, letting your 9-year-old watch Game of Thrones unrestricted is probably not a good idea. Well, now you've eroded their trust. The implicit bias one, especially, I went to a conference where I had I had to basically do a mea culpa in front of a couple of attorneys when they're like, social psychologists have made our lives so difficult because of implicit bias training. I'm like, look, I promise that's a lot of us don't believe in that. And when you apply to COVID, you can claim that there's one voice all you want. Eventually, dissidence is going to break out, or you're just going to kill your discipline. Those are the two things. You're either not going to have contrary voices able to speak, you're going to turn insular, and your discipline's going to disappear, which I don't think is possible in something as broad as medicine. Yeah. Or eventually you're going to eat crow. And when you eat crow, there's going to be a massive loss of face and lack of trust. And so I think it's wise to speak with one voice when it is worth speaking with one voice, and I think that when there isn't actually one voice, you have to swallow your pride and say, hey, people who are smart you don't have to say you agree with them to say that there are smart people who disagree with you on a subject, right? You don't have to say I agree with them, but you can at least acknowledge they're out there and that there isn't a unified view.
Yeah, you mentioned one thing early on in that answer. You're talking about the experiment with the people turning the knobs, and you mentioned that people have given $1, so basically a token amount. It's basically nothing. Yeah. So versus people who are given $20. So almost sort of like if there's a lot of cost, or if there's a lot of value to doing it by the fact you're paid $20, that you can be more honest in your assessment of why you're spending an hour doing something, versus if you really got no payment, that you felt that there was you had to justify in your mind why you did something that was mind-numbing and dumb. I feel like maybe you see that a lot in this group thinking on Twitter or social media, where you see people who get really no reward for holding certain positions, yet they seem to go to the mat to try and justify and to just try and be part of the in group.
Yeah, the I effing love science crowd, I refer to them in my research design class, because they tend to have that either they belong to that group or they'll retweet from that page. I think there's some of it. I think there's definitely some groupthink that there's also just group dynamics there as well. I am on the side of science. I am on the side of righteousness. Behold my value because I agree. Like, yeah, you have. I know of a couple of people, and I'll keep this as vague as I possibly can, who insist on like reposting and talking, and they're like, well, I'm an activist for COVID education, and I'm like, you don't have a degree in medicine, you don't have a degree in science, you're not like there. I know people who also just do this and like they're trying to keep their local community informed. That's a totally different
sure,
phenomenon. But as opposed to saying, hey, these are the COVID numbers, get vaccinated. That's one thing. But there are people actively representing themselves as if they're like able to talk on the subject or speak on the subject, and I'm like, I could not possibly care less about your opinion if I tried. I want to hear from a doctor, or because if they're a data scientist, I want to hear from my kind of doctor instead of your kind of doctor.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
Either way, the PhD or MD or DO needs to be involved in this discussion. I don't care about you as a concerned citizen, but they think that because they're on the right side, that they're entitled, that they somehow have the right opinion and the righteous opinion, and that typical group dynamics. Once you're attacking an out group to bolster your in group, we know that people will go to extreme lengths to make sure that happens as good as they can.
Well, and when you're talking about speaking with one voice, clearly, if you have something, to your point, if it's something that there's a preponderance of evidence, every reason to believe that gravity exists, there's no reason to you should speak with one voice. If you jump off a cliff, you're going, bad things are going to happen, right? If you don't have a parachute, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
But when you have a lot of uncertainty, which we do in this situation and lots of certain situations in science, that you have to be more careful, because if you're found to be wrong, you've now, like you said, eat crow. We have lots of people who've clearly been shown to be wrong, who've been making decisions with policy, whether it's Fauci with his initial discussion on, masks are good, masks are bad. You should wear 2 masks. You should wear them outside. What are you talking about? We should never wear it outside, right? We have people who seem to lack, reflection, that they were wrong at times and they never own it. So how important is it to own it? And can you own it? Like someone like Fauci, is he just so far gone that even if you try to own things now, there's just no coming back? Or how do they sort of recover from this and hopefully, maintain their, their authority within the public health sphere?
I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified to say if Fauci himself can come back from this. Speaking for myself, I would never trust him again. I'm not the biggest fan of Rand Paul, but watching him spar with Fauci when Fauci's trying to say, well, I never did gain of function research. And then I'm like, it's literally in the paper. Like, if one of my students tried to do this, it's like watching my students try to justify that when I've caught them plagiarizing, I'm like, no, you need to cite a reference. Well, no, I don't, because I used a different term, and I'm like, that's still plagiarism. That's how I felt with that. So I'm not sure Fauci can ever gain back his trust. I do think that there has been an enormous loss of trust, and I think in the short term getting it back will be difficult, but I think it can be gotten back. The thing is that first of all, you're going to have to admit that you don't know things, and that's scary for everyone. Because as many people as have lost trust in the government, there are some people who this is all they have. All they have is trust in the official reports. And that sounds very conspiratorial, but I mean, I think all of us kind of fall prey to that in some way, in some arena or another.
Oh, sure.
About something. I mean, like, I'm not a medical doctor. I know nothing about vaccines, but I trust enough people to say that I think when they tell me a vaccine works, even outside of COVID, right? Like I have a 1-month-old daughter. She is getting her vaccines based on the schedule that her pediatrician says, because I'm not going to battle a pediatrician. We all surrender ourselves to an authority in some way, shape, or form. And there's so much uncertainty with COVID that, it would be scary for a lot of people if the government said we don't know. But I think ultimately that becomes less of a psychological question than it does a moral one. And this is something I actually do kind of disagree with Dr. Sandman on. He says, wouldn't it be better to just admit uncertainty? I agree with him morally. Like, yeah, morally, if you're not certain, you need to say you're not certain. And I believe that as a good scientist, you should do that. I mean, there is no science without statistics. That's the world we live in. We live in an age of empiricism. That debate was settled a long time ago. And statistics is inherently uncertain. It's all inherent, whether you're doing classical or Bayesian. It's all inherently about probabilities. Sure. Yeah. But most, having taught Intro to Stats now that's the class I've taught the most throughout grad school and now as a professor, that is something that even potential scientists struggle with. Like, when you tell your class, like, hey, and we don't know anything and we've proved nothing, we test null hypotheses, it's very unsatisfying. Humans do not like uncertainty. We don't like acknowledging that we could be wrong or that we don't know something. And even within science, I mean, anyone who's ever applied for a grant, you know better than to say, well, it would be nice if we found this. You say, no, we're going to find it. Give us $50,000. So I think it would be morally better to admit uncertainty, and I think that would gain some of the trust that has been lost with people who, shall we say, are more skeptical. It could also then lose other people's trust. I don't know. I don't know what would happen. I can't predict the future because I will admit my own uncertainty. And this is such an unprecedented thing in a lot of ways, because this has happened in an era of mass communication as opposed to, the government's done some shady stuff before, but the Tuskegee experiments did not have entire Reddit threads and 4chan things
right, yeah.
dedicated to them. Looking at some of the psychological and behavioral economic research that's been done about restoring government trust. Ironically, actually, a lot of it deals with, again, criminal justice, and some of it actually also deals with finances. The recent attempts by the nation of Greece to try to, basically tax its citizens, all of whom have basically gone, what right do you have to tax us? You don't know what you're doing with money. So the interesting findings in both cases is you can't just make a process. You can't just punish people. And you can't just say, well, we'll just make taxes more effective, or we'll try to create a system that does what we want, which seems to be the thing that even now in COVID discussions, we need a system to get people vaccinated. I'm like, well, we have a ton of vaccines and they're going to waste. What you need to do is actually have some accountability, and also maybe not admit you were. Well, no, you have to admit you were wrong because you were wrong, like the whole mask thing, like you mentioned.
Yeah, right.
But also, I think the way we approach this and we try to persuade people. There's what's called one-sided and two-sided persuasion. And one-sided persuasion is me saying, I'm right, I know I'm right, totally right. And sometimes when done from an expert in a certain sphere, this is effective. Like when there isn't a ton of debate about it. I don't think if I were going to talk about, say, the Milgram experiment to a bunch of non-psychologists and I say, this is my interpretation of it, I think they'll take that as its word. In fact, if I were to say,
I've never heard of it. Yeah.
Oh, well, not necessarily that relevant to this, but we can talk about it later. But if I go, okay, well, I think this, but other people think this, I might undermine myself. But that's if I were going to talk about the Milgram experiment to a bunch of people who've never heard of it before, and my job is to communicate that as the expert. Teachers do one-sided attempts at persuasion.
Okay.
But when there is debate, there's what's called two-sided persuasion. And that's where you acknowledge that other points exist and you still hold to what you believe. You still say things, okay, this is what I believe. There are alternatives. I think they're wrong, and here's why. But you recognize them, and what's important is you have to do it respectfully. You make appeals to both sides. you include conflicting information. The phrase I'm reading here from a quote from a paper is, you must include conflicting information in a concessive way. You acknowledge other people's concerns. This was actually something that I did some research on this. Unfortunately, it never got beyond a pilot study because March 2020 happened. But we were looking at vaccines in a non-global pandemic way. And what's interesting is that people, our research showed something like this. There's other research out there that shows it more strongly. Even with vaccine hesitant people before COVID, if you said, hey, I understand you. Like, for example, the big one is vaccines cause autism. And so anyway, they don't cause autism. That's all lies. Go, hey, like, there's a claim that people say it's cause autism and that the rates have risen. But do you know that the rates have risen because children aren't dropping like flies? And because of these vaccines, they live a lot longer, and we are better at identifying autism. That's why the rates have risen. It's not that the vaccines cause autism. People are more receptive to that. I don't think I've ever heard the government use two-sided persuasion about anything, ever. Certainly nothing involving health communication, to my knowledge.
Right.
You'd know better than I would, but I have certainly not seen it.
I mean, I guess... this sort of reminds me a little bit. I talked to Dr. Serlo. She did some research on colonialism and mistrust in medicine from Central Africa. I think she mainly spent most of her time in Congo. And she would talk about how I think it was the French, the colonial forces at that time, were basically forcing medical treatments of people on villagers. And they were, vaccinations for, I think it was sleeping sickness. But a lot of their treatments, of course, they would kill people. There's no question they did. Maybe they saved lives in general, but they were just kind of experimenting on people against their will. And the general level of distrust 50 years later towards this medical advice was still present. If you compared, where villages where people were forced to submit to these medical experiments versus villages that weren't, 3 generations later, people were still very distrustful of modern medicine, of just, of basic sort of medications and healthcare strategies. And it's something that really concerns me because I look at this and I think, there are a lot of things that medicine does that's really good at, but I feel like we're kind of throwing everything away for no gain at this point. And I'm very worried that we're going to have significant vaccine hesitancy on all sorts of things that, we've been well established up to this point. And I don't know how you get that back. And because I do think that, to your point earlier, I think there's not been much empathy towards people who are disagreeing, and I see this with all my colleagues online and social. Now, these are just people who are yelling on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, and they're people, generally prominent people, deans of medical schools or whatever, and yelling at people. And I say yelling because I think that's actually accurate, that they were actually truly yelling at people and essentially calling them terrible people for not getting vaccinated, for not wearing masks, for not social isolating, for whatever. I mean, whatever the company line is, they were being chewed out, for lack of a better term, right? Which is never a very good persuasive technique, in my opinion, right? I mean, what is the best persuasion technique? I mean, I'm sure the psychologists have figured this out, and I'm guessing yelling at people outside of maybe a coach at the last, maybe making a point on the football field, maybe then yelling at someone is effective.
Even then, like, you get a lot of anger when you tell people especially from an older generation, like, well, I was yelled at and it turned out just fine. It's like, yeah, but if you don't yell at people, people, discussion works better. Empathy works better. Empathy is like, again, even legitimacy, going all the way back to legitimacy, people want to feel acknowledged. They want to feel respected. And again, like, there are some reasons for vaccine hesitancy that I don't think deserve the time of day.
Sure.
I'm just going to be honest. It's really interesting to me that actually the biggest, before all this, some of the biggest constituencies of vaccine hesitancy came from the left.
Oh, yeah, no question. Yeah.
Absolutely. It was a thing. And even before COVID, I would bring this up and people would look at me like, well, no, because the left is pro-science. And I'm like, have you ever met a hippie? Like, go to California. Like, I meet them all the time. Like, oh, man, I'm super left-wing, like crystals. And I'm like, I'm going to stop you right there. You have people saying, like, they don't like vaccines because, it's artificial and it's dirty. And I'm like, okay, that's one thing. But there's been such an us versus them reductionism in the discourse around this. I mean, you see it even in the definition of anti-vaxxer. Like, when it's like even people who oppose vaccine mandates, It's like, okay, this is you are creating an artificial dichotomy that we already knew didn't work when it came to non-COVID vaccines, because there were some people who had different concerns. That's why the scales and the measures were trying to differentiate what concerns do you have, because alleviating different concerns. You're probably never going to convince Gwyneth Paltrow to become a pro-vaccine advocate. But you might be able to convince somebody who's like, well, don't they cause autism? It's like, well, no, you can show them the facts. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we are currently in a situation where like there's going to be long-term effects to this. It makes me really upset. And I do think that those people yelling at social media, and I think you're right that they are yelling. And I think it matters, because when people see that, like, oh, well, I'm a little hesitant about vaccines, but I guess I am a bad person. Well, screw it. I don't need to change. This is the sort of person I am. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's all this stereotyping and prejudice that goes on just based on group membership, which is the psychological definition of prejudice, treating people differently based on group membership. You've created the group anti-vaxxer, you've thrown them in it, now you're treating them like dirt, where they're never going to change their minds. And we live in a nation where our rule of law makes it so that you're not going to be able to go out there and forcibly vaccinate these people. I've seen people talk about that and they think it's a great idea, and I'm like, okay, we don't have much to discuss. But thank God you're a fringe. But that's making this worse. We need to have that two-sided persuasion, and that just takes humility. And I mean, there was one person who was relatively humble in politics, and he left his party and now isn't in the House of Representatives anymore, and just lives in Grand Rapids. So yeah, other than that, I don't know of particularly humility being a thing in politics. It's all about scoring points. And I will say this is another one of those things. I'm like, this applies to both sides. I won't name the politician, but it's a popular one on social media. I follow plenty of people on social media I disagree with. And they were talking about the White House's press release today basically said something, along the lines of, hey, we're not going to shut down the economy if and we aren't going to take people who've been vaccinated. You've been doing all you can. People who haven't been vaccinated, you're in for trouble.
More than trouble, yeah.
Yeah, and now they went on to talk about legal ramifications and things that I don't think are a good idea and are just going to provoke reactants. But what this politician said about it and in the comments on this post, people are going, yeah, they think they're better than you. And in the back of my head, I'm going, yeah, I have a little daughter who, I've had this conversation with family and friends. I'm like, yeah, you aren't vaccinated. You are not, and you get within 10 feet of her, we're going to have a problem. Don't put your germs on my kid, and not just COVID, like anything. You have to have your shots. I have a kid. And like, well, you're just taking a political angle. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, the other side does this too, and that they're not willing to understand that there are genuine concerns from people. COVID is scary. COVID is terrifying, or the uncertainty around it is terrifying, and the fact that this is, we're pushing 2 years here. Yeah, that's scary. And I think that putting this in the right and left isn't really helpful, but people on the anti-vax and anti-COVID legislation side, they also need to understand that there are reasons people are scared and that they're upset. And that just rallying and saying, well, they're all authoritarian scum, and they're wearing a mask because they're afraid, and they want you to have a vaccine before you go into their business. That's because they're a bad person. I'm like, well, no, this goes both ways here. Try to have some freaking empathy.
Yeah. Well, my wife's a pediatrician, and her clinic visits are oftentimes reduced to two discussions. One is convincing people that their child will not die from COVID because they're young, healthy, they may be vaccinated, but that the threat is not. It's not like Ebola. It's not the Black Plague that's coming on, and yet these people are terrified, living in fear, anxiety, and they're a mess. And then she has the other conversation. It's only these two conversations, pretty much. The other conversation is, yeah, COVID's either not real, vaccines are totally ineffective, people are just being crazy about this thing, and I've got a good immune system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Or I'm going to avoid getting it. I'm careful, or something like. There's no middle ground in this sort of discussion, and from your background in political psychology, I'm curious because I always associated before COVID, and I would even say probably before 2015. I thought my understanding of the world was valid. I've questioned all of it now since then, at least as far as how I group people, left and right. I always felt like people on the left, generally speaking, were not anti-authoritarian, but more suspicious and more, less trusting of authority in general, right? That was at least growing up when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, that people which is why you'd expect people to be less trusting of the government, of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And so it was natural that you'd find anti-vaccination positions from people on the left. And generally people on the right, I always felt they were pro-authority, pro-law and order, that they were more comfortable with that. And so I feel like the world has flipped upside down in the last 2 years. Am I totally wrong, or or do both sides have authoritarian principles? Just kind of depends on who you're looking at.
I don't really like the left-right dichotomy myself, frankly. I have a very close friend and collaborator who she calls herself an outright socialist. And anyone I would call myself a classical liberal, though for the sake of the argument, for the sake of just communication now, I just tell people, yeah, I'm a centrist. And she and I agree on 75% of things. So I think one of the problems with the left-right dichotomy, and this really applies to vaccines, I really like moral foundations theory from Jonathan Haidt, who is apparently now right-wing. People, I mentioned Jonathan Haidt the other day, and he's basically just a fascist. And I'm like, I've met Jonathan Haidt. He wouldn't remember me. I'm not going to try to toot my head, I'm friends with Jonathan Haidt. I'm like, no, I once had a beer at the same table at SBSB with him once. But he is not. If he is right-wing, I don't think even Stalin, well, no, maybe Stalin would call him right-wing, but unless you are an actual tanky, the USSR wasn't that bad idiot, which, not to be unempathetic, but if you genuinely are that far left, there's no way that Jonathan Haidt counts as right-wing. But what he talks about a lot, and why he shifted to the center when he was pretty left-wing, was that people have all these different moral concerns. And different moral concerns underline what we typically think of as right and left. And different moral concerns can lead you to the same conclusion, but for different reasons. So with the issue of vaccines, we know that people become more anti-vax, we'll say, quote-unquote, the left, because of purity concerns. They're concerned about contaminating themselves. They're concerned about, that's yucky. But we know people on the right will be concerned about it, because of morals. The idea of whether it be the abortion argument or just plain old, liberty, the government's telling me to do something, I shouldn't have to do it. Beyond the moral foundations, I think there's also just who's in charge. The left was all very anti-authoritarian. You mentioned growing up in the 80s and 90s. I remember growing up in the noughties and, early 2010s and being in high school and college. And yeah, Barack Obama became president, but he became a lame duck pretty quickly, and there was still a lot of blame being thrown at Bush. The idea was that the authorities were right-wing. But now that Joe Biden has taken over and he had a supposed mandate, a word that has now gotten so much more meaning, who's the authority now? It's different when we are in charge. We wouldn't be authoritarian. We would only do this to you for your own good. That's that cognitive dissonance I was talking about. You always go, we are the good guys, so when we're doing this, doesn't mean we're the bad guys. It doesn't mean that there's a good reason to do this. Again, with the vaccine policies, people would David French wrote an article a couple of weeks ago where he said if you told people 10 years ago on the right that they would say they would never take a vaccine, there'd be an anti-vaccine movement with them that would take the right wing by storm, even though it could potentially save lives, they'd have laughed at you. But the difference is that now it's them who's talking about vaccines and pushing, quote unquote, the vaccine, and they are bad. So if they have done it, it is good. Ergo, I'm going to be anti-vaccine. So I think there's just kind of the natural cycle of authority and who's in charge there that's pushing people to that perspective. The problem with that, from my point of view, is that science shouldn't be left or right. Science should, or if you want to go horseshoe theory, whatever you want to say, science should be ideologically as neutral as possible. We obviously we're going to have our own views, but we shouldn't just we shouldn't take a stance on certain things. And the World Health Organization does this all the time, where it feels entitled to make proclamations that really have nothing to do with health. And it seems like Dr. Fauci is kind of taking that perspective too, where it's like, if it even slightly tentatively connects to health, I can talk about it. And we're seeing that across, guns are becoming a health issue. I'm like, how are they a health issue? All right, how is the ability to regulate travel really going? Is that really going to have an effect on public health versus all the other outcomes? I don't think it is, but that's a political decision. And yet, because science is supposed to be neutral, people can claim that they're being neutral, and I think that's what's kind of happening here. That was a very roundabout way to answer that question.
Yeah, no, but I follow that, and I think when it comes to authority, especially, I would say the last 6 to 7 years or so, I'm not sure exactly what the right timeline is, but you definitely feel like the authority, even when Trump was president, that he didn't carry a lot of authority within people who are decision makers, either within the government. You felt like he had a loose hold on the reins, I guess you'd say, and ability to persuading within the government institutions, the machinations that are going on in the government, certainly within culture and media. I mean, there are very few outlets, I felt like, that were sympathetic to his view. I mean, and they tend to speak in unanimity when it comes to a lot of things with COVID, or the government line, whatever that might be. And I think that's to one of the points that Dr. Simon wrote as well, where he was talking about one of the big problems too right now that he sees is that there's not a diversity of opinions, of views, or of people of politics within decision makers. Right? You have people who all seem to be coming from the same. They're all liberal, let's say, on the left, and there aren't people who are the Jay Bhattacharya's, the John Ioannidis's, the guys who are the contrarians. I guess they're not at all involved in decision making or the discussion at all. They're largely now I guess we've been exposed that they've been sort of actively discredited by Dr. Fauci and the NIH director, Dr. Collins, but they were at least if at best ignored, and so that has caused a further division, I guess, and forcing people into camps and politicizing something that probably shouldn't have been politicized.
Yeah. I think that something else Salmon said, and this is again, I've had my students do this for stats all the time. Scientific thinking is not easy. Statistical thinking is definitely not easy. Even certain people who might use the phrase, I use facts, logic, and statistics. I'm like, you use none of those very often. And yet people, they throw a statistic out and they think the media sucks at it. Like across the board, right or left wing, it doesn't matter. And Dr. Sandman mentioned this, right? Like, they are not health communicators, and nor should they be. That's not their job. I know plenty of journalists I know several journalists personally who are decent people, good people. They're not trained to know how to communicate research because that's not their purview. But now we've kind of had science has become politicized, and it's become a way to demonstrate your value. I'm on the right side of this. And yeah, I think that maybe we should have scientists actually. I don't know what this would look like. This is totally big, large construal level thinking, high construal level thinking, but maybe scientists should actually try to communicate this themselves and learn to talk like normal people. And I'm not volunteering myself for that because I stink at it. But we need people with more scientific education presenting these things and being able to do it in such a way that garners expertise. And here's the other thing that's really important. I meant to say this earlier, but I think I really would not forgive myself if I didn't get this out, and it's really relevant. Not only are two-sided arguments more persuasive, they make people trust you more. And I think so. Like, if you actually want people to, if you want to effectively communicate about COVID, and you want to bring the people in who are doubting, having any of the 5 late night hosts, one of whom has a British accent. Other than that, they're all totally identical. Deliver some high and mighty monologue that isn't funny about, and that is flippant about how, don't we hate all those people? It's like, cool. You're not convincing anyone. And again, I'm fully vaxxed and don't really have much time for the anti-vaccine rhetoric, but I do believe in convincing people, and I hate flippancy. And instead, why don't we have somebody come out and say something like, hey, vaccines are good and you should get vaccinated, but you also don't need to lose your head about COVID. Here's what we know, and here's what we don't know. Having someone like be able to write like Dr. Sandman and have this paper and these things given out to the public, and have that be what we're focusing on instead of the debate basically being still, whether right or left, quote unquote. Why do the bad guys' views on COVID not matter, and why should you ignore them and listen to me? That is basically every talk show's take on COVID. It just depends on who they think's the bad guy and what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's the closest thing I can think of to a solution. But there's been so much damage done to the scientific community, which was already, I still trust in science, but part of that, what that means, that doesn't mean that I worship it. I acknowledge science's limits. And I think that I trust when somebody tells me that they have something perfect, they have this clear, there's no question about this. I'm like, this better be gravity or or I don't trust you. And while not all doubt in science is valid, and I do think science can regain that doubt and regain its ground and assuage those doubts, we've lost a lot of ground. And I think that if the longer we take to actually acknowledge we need to make two-sided appeals and try to bring people back and show some empathy and acknowledge what the limits of our knowledge are, the more ground we lose.
Do you? I mean, when you're looking at things right now, I like to try and come up with solutions. It doesn't sometimes, it's all speculation at this point. What you'd have to do to actually regain the public's trust. I feel like when it comes to the United States at this point, I think Anthony Fauci, there's no way you're going to ever have him serve in a role where that people are going to trust him that are opposed to his viewpoints at this point. There's nothing he can say, there's nothing he can do that is going to regain anyone's trust in the institutions that he leads, the FDA or the CDC or NIH, right? I feel like the only way you can fix the problem is to really have him retire, fire him, whatever, and replace him. And have to have a real dialogue with people who are the contrarian voices. I don't see that happening, but I feel like that's really the only way we're going to ever find any sort of reasonable consensus within the country as far as our path forward. Do you think that's accurate, or do you think there really is something that Fauci could say or do, or there's some sort of thing that would actually bring us back? And I hate picking on Anthony Fauci. Well, I don't totally hate it. I mean, because he has been in charge, and he's been in charge a long time, which to the point also, which is related but not related, but it's a little unrelated. It is important to recognize these are political appointees, and I think people forget this. They think, oh, he's a scientist, he's really smart, and yes, he's those things. There's no question about that. But he is also a political animal. He's been in the same position for 40 years. You don't survive in a position like that by being a bumpkin and not knowing how to work the political angles, work the media, and have your allies within legislatures to protect you. And so it's totally understandable that he is very adept at tearing people down and maintaining his position of prominence, because unless you're doing something truly crooked, like, embezzling, you can last a long time in politics just by being a good political animal. And I think that's what he's been, but it doesn't help him in sort of regaining his prominence.
The man has his own Disney Plus special. Well, actually, I think it's technically National Geographic. It's on Disney Plus. When I log in to watch, to watch my Marvel or Star Wars shows, I see it recommended. It's there. Yeah, he's a political animal, and he's definitely swayed. He's definitely lobbied his celebrity, and I think you're probably right. That is just my opinion. I can't. Yeah, well, it's just like my opinion, man. I don't think there's anything Fauci can do. I think, however, the problem with fixing it is that you'd need there to be truly bipartisan efforts to appoint maybe a council, maybe a committee of people to head it up. Good luck. I broke my rule and looked at social media this morning about Biden's plans for Build Back Better, and just seeing the response from some of my leftist friends about Tim Manchin calling him a traitor and saying, well, he disagreed with us. West Virginia shouldn't even count. His vote shouldn't count. And I'm like, okay, we don't even have the public. You all need to take a civics lesson. The same thing I would say to people who said, oh, but Biden isn't the legitimate president. You all need to take a civics lesson, and a lot of other things. That's the populace, and with the representative government, the media and the representatives absolutely know that, and I think that they know that there will be punishment if they talk to each other. They get off of scoring political points on the opposition. I think very few people are immune to that. Actually, maybe the only one I could think of is the guy who replaced is Meyer.
Yeah.
Put him in charge of it. Maybe he could do this. But I think if they could all put on their big boy pants, big girl pants, and sit down and have a good discussion and maybe set up a tribunal. And I'm not saying everyone, again, like, there are certain things, and maybe I'm speaking outside my lane, so if you think I'm wrong, feel free to call me out. But I nothing I have read suggests that ivermectin was going to work the way people were talking about it. Certainly not the point that, it became a lot more annoying to buy my dog's heartworm medicine. Yeah. And similarly with, hydroxychloroquine, I know there's mixed evidence, but certainly it wasn't the cure-all people were talking about. I'm not saying we have to let those people on the committee, but letting a plethora of people across the board be on the committee, talk about these issues, seems like it would regain some public trust. And I think that's really important. And I don't see it happening, but if it did happen, I think it could be effective.
Yeah,
but that's super high constable level, and I'm not in politics for a reason. So
well, and I feel like if there are probably plenty of people who don't care, which is I'm sure there's no shortage of people who don't really care. They'll just kind of cram their viewpoint down, or they'll just say we're just never going to agree, and so we're not going to try. But I feel like that at some point someone's going to try and do this. I mean, that was that was one of the selling points of Biden, right? Was that we're going to grow up. We're not going to have all this petty bickering and this sort of thing. And it's been
that happened.
I mean, I can't see any difference from what it was before,
nope.
except that maybe we're buying from the public with what, or the not public, but the press with what Biden's doing. But I'm not surprised. I'm saddened that it didn't really improve at all. But I guess we kind of almost have to leave it at that, because there's clearly no way we're going to solve these problems, except to say that I think from a psychological standpoint, there are definitely some real problems with the way that communication's occurring, and that the groupthink is a problem, cognitive dissonance. And I guess that'd be the one last question I have for you, because everyone talks about cognitive dissonance, which is basically that you're, sort of like seeing alternative reality, and despite all the facts presented to you, if it goes against what your concrete beliefs are, or whatever, that you will deny them or alter them in order to fit in your structure, how you see the world. But right now I believe, and I've just, as I watch things, I feel like I'm just sort of in the middle, but people obviously feel differently, I'm sure, my listeners, but I feel like Omicron, when it's coming in, seems much more benign. It seems like we're moving towards a little less lethal virus, certainly one that's probably more infectious. I don't think there's much question about that. But if that's the case, I think, people at some point are going to have to accept the fact that this thing has gotten over, and that they're no longer going to be at risk for dying all the time. And I think, how do people change that? I mean, how do you, if you have all the facts, and let's say we know a month from now that yes, the rate of death is 1/10 or less from Omicron, that the Delta wave. Yes, it's more infectious. You're going to get sick, but it's going to be kind of like a cold, or really bad cold, which we all have had bad colds. How do you convince people? I mean, do you have to have like the guy at the top, Fauci, tell them that, and then they're going to say, okay, is it like a tribal thing? How do we fix that problem?
I mean, as for the questions you asked before, how do we fix the problem? The answer, I think, is yes. It's tribal. Some people would be convinced if it came top down. Some people would be convinced if they're doctors. There'd be so many things we'd have to try. I'm not sure it's a cognitive dissonance thing. Cognitive dissonance is actually more about your own behaviors, and you see yourself acting against your own beliefs, and you're like, okay, you either change your beliefs or explain away your behavior. Okay. So while it does apply in this debate, I'm not sure it's necessarily what's at work with Omicron. I think what you're seeing with the Omicron variant, and the attitudes towards it rather, are just the addictive nature of panic. And this has been true about again, whatever your cause, outrage is powerful, but it's a very hot emotion, and emotions are exhausting. And which is a very Gen Z thing to say, but emotions I'm not even Gen Z, but emotions are exhausting, and you have to keep the fires of outrage stoked. And that's been the thing with COVID. And I'm not saying it's not been a big deal, because it's been a very big deal. I've lost friends and family to COVID. In fact, I genuinely get angry when I hear people say it's not a real disease, and I'm like, how many people died?
Right. Yeah.
Like you're throwing away lives. But on the other hand, like people are gonna get burned out. So if you want, there seems to be this idea that if everything isn't the worst thing, it's kind of like with the analogy I use is, it's kind of like how I find a lot of action movies boring because there's James Bond movies. Back in the 80s, and James Bond villain could just want a bunch of people to live underwater, and that was fine. Now it has to be every single villain ever in every movie, whether it's Bond or Marvel or whatever. They have to be destroying the world. There are no villains who just have small plans anymore. The 90s mummy movies were just at least the first one was he's just a guy who wants to get his powers and get his girlfriend back. Now the one with Tom Cruise, what are they going to do? Oh, they're going to destroy the world. Right, that's all we have anymore. Same in politics. Everything's world-ending. Everything's catastrophic. If you don't act now, people will die, and it's on both sides. Sure. You saw, for example, just to make sure I'm picking on the right, people are now getting outraged. Oh, there's a rise in suicides among teenage girls because of social media, and I'm like, it's a negligible rise and an already low rate. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but you are talking about banning Instagram via government mandate. You don't see the problem with this? Same thing, COVID is serious. The Omicron, let's say a month from now, the Omicron variant is serious. But if it is a lesser rate of death, that should be a good thing. And actually, this might be where cognitive dissonance comes in. I may have talked myself into this. At this point, we are so used to, COVID bad, COVID disaster, COVID world ending.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks like Omicron may just be the virus kind of fizzling out and becoming like other coronaviruses in the past. But that doesn't go with what I've been doing about everything about COVID is always the worst mummy movie ending the world level threat thing. No, Omicron must be worth it. Omicron is terrible and we need to shut down everything because, there's a tension there. And there's a motivated tension there because, in terms of the 24-hour news cycle, it sells. In terms of group dynamics, it's a way to prove you're one of the good guys or one of the bad guys by being pro or anti-vax. In terms of our society, it's a way to say, see, those people are bad versus our people who are good. There's so much motivation behind what cognition you could hold on this issue that it might genuinely just be, well, either we give all this up or we just say that Omicron's a disaster. And that's why I think you saw this before with every other variant, right? Like, oh, there's a new variant coming, and I'm like, we don't even know yet.
Yeah, right.
But it's already a disaster. And I think the way out of this isn't because you mentioned that we'd have to leave it there. I think there is one important thing to say about it, and that is we can't control the government. I know in theory we're supposed to be able to by voting. That's a lovely thought. I think what's more important though is how we talk to other people. And I'm not saying over this Christmas give your unvaccinated aunt a hug. No, but I think that when people bring up doubts. I've even seen this in my own family. People bring up doubts, and the immediate thing is, "You're such an beeping idiot." Why don't you know? Demonize or even demonizing them, not knowing people in the group may have doubts. Having that empathy, and if you're convinced about something, that's great. If you're convinced about pro-vaccines, good. So am I. But think about why people are worried and try to talk about it, because we all know we're going to talk about this over Christmas, right? Or maybe other people will not, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to.
Oh,
yeah. When that happens, I'm Jewish. I'm barely engaged with Christmas anyway. I have to talk about something. When that happens, try to show that empathy. I think that's how we could affect real change. And I think it does. It's all very feel good and Disney Channel and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I think it really has to be. If it comes from us and it comes from an individual, hey, this is what I think, and people really stop seeing each other as threats, then we might see some change. Certainly, I think it's more effective than trying to think about how we can convince the Republicans and Democrats to get along.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll leave it at that. It does feel a little bit like a Hallmark movie. We just need some love, and we need to care for each other. But you know what? In some ways, that
imagine there's no true. COVID.
Well, I hope at some point the Biden administration. I mean, there are two ways to look at Omicron. One is you can say, Armageddon, close everything down, the end of the, be running in the streets, panicking, buying up all the toilet paper, or you can look at it and say, hey, this might be our W, right? I mean, for an administration that's been struggling, it would be they could claim the win, right? We survived to the point where now it's getting better, but I think. We'll see. Hopefully they go with that. Dr. Pomerantz, Dr. Aaron Pomerantz from St. Thomas University. in Houston, Texas. Thanks so much for being on The Paradox. If people want to follow more stuff from you, where's a good place for them to check you out on social media, etc.?
I'm actually kind of between social media things. I'm thinking of getting a Twitter because apparently we're supposed to have Twitters as academics. I can get you that if you want to. I occasionally write for the Foundation for Economic Education. I don't really have much of a social media presence at the moment. My defense is that I just had a daughter, and it's been 9 months of pregnancy and now 1 month of forgetting what sleep feels like. So eventually I might get back on social media.
Suddenly you'll have those days where she sleeps through the night. You're like, wow, I'd forgotten what it was like to sleep. I didn't realize I was missing that. And then it'll just
she slept for like 5 hours the other night, and between feedings, and my wife and I looked at each other like, oh, it was like we were seeing with new, have been closed for a long time eyes. So.
Yes. Well, I would tell you, if you have a second one, you'll be shocked at how quickly you've forgotten what it's like to be sleep deprived, and then again how relieving it is to be able to sleep again. It's like being sick, right? You feel terrible when you're sick, and then if only I could be healthy. And then once you're healthy for about a week, you forget what it's like to be sick again because you're just healthy. It's a human condition, right? Well, Thanks again for being on the show. And
my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.